All right, we're back. We're looking now, this is lecture 2. I'm going to put all these on YouTube relatively at the same time, but I'll clearly identify them. Lecture 2 for today, March 23rd, 2002, in the midst of a global pandemic. I'm for some reason teaching from home, or for that very reason. Looking at the book Pride and Prejudice, we're going to look at 2 chapters to give you a better understanding of the first midterm question about the relationship between being in love with someone and how you act towards them. Do you act polite or do you act impolite? And the whole joke of this book is that people who really love each other don't have to be polite. In fact, that's what Darcy loves about Lizzie, is that she's not just kissing his ass all the time like all these other women who are into him do. Okay, including especially Miss Bingley, Mr. Bingley, Jane, Lizzie's sister's boyfriend, soon-to-be fiance. Sorry, spoiler alert. Okay, we're going to look at a chapter now in Volume 2, Chapter 2, overall Chapter 25 of the book. I'm going to start on page 138 in my edition. If you're in any edition, this is, again, Chapter 25 overall. Volume 2, Chapter 2, I'm in the 1, 2, 3, 4th, 5th, and 6th paragraph. The beginning of the paragraph is when alone with Elizabeth afterwards. What's happened here, we're in Volume 2 now, so what develops in Volume 2, basically every major character is introduced in Volume 1. Okay, so we have the Bennets, and we have this family who are the Bennets. There's 5 sisters. Elizabeth's the main character in the book. She's the protagonist, the heroine. She's a famous figure in literature for women's independence, women's liberation, and for really a woman whose independence of mind and spirit. She's not a revolutionary in any profound, sense, but she's a figure for women's freedom of thought, independence of mind, and having like a spirited mentality. Okay, and she's one of these characters. We're watching people in this class grow up, and when they grow up, what the fundamental thing they do is they think for themselves. That's what it means to be enlightened in Western civilization. You think for yourself, and Lizzie does that. She's not afraid to speak her mind to people who are richer, more powerful, think more highly of themselves than she does. She's got her wits about her, and that's what makes her such an appealing and memorable character, is that she thinks for herself. Okay, so we're going to see her doing that here. And what happens throughout the first part of the book is she's introduced, her older sister Jane is introduced. They're similarly beautiful and charming to men, but they don't have much to recommend them financially. So it's going to be difficult for them to find a husband in the circumstances we find them in, where rank matters. You want to preserve your rank and all this sort of stuff. We're also introduced in the first part of the book to all these leading suitors. Okay, Jane, her older sister, who's considered more beautiful than Lizzie, she has one main suitor, this guy Bingley. And then Bingley has a friend, Darcy, who's even richer than him, more handsome, and he doesn't like Lizzie at first, but then he starts to like her. Not only because she's beautiful, but because she's so smart and funny and clever. Okay, the reasons you want someone to like you, not because of your looks, but because of who you are and how you treat other people and all that sort of stuff. Now, in the first part of the book, also introduced is another suitor, this guy, Mr. Collins, who's a distant cousin of the Bennets, but he also stands to inherit their dad's property when the dad dies. So he's there to meet them and maybe pick a wife from amongst them. None of them like him because he's a dork. He's a fool. If you've been watching any of the film versions of this, it's made very clear. And part of why he's a fool is that he stands on ceremony. He thinks just because someone outranks you, you have to kiss their ass really openly and publicly. And you don't have to do that. That's considered taking manners too far. All right? We're looking at now part of and so what happens in the first part of the book is Jane and Bingley become attached. They like each other, and then people conspire. And only Lizzie really thinks this at first, but it becomes evident throughout the book. They conspire to separate them. Darcy is guilty of separating Lizzie's sister from this guy who likes her. And now the passage I'm going to read you is Lizzie explaining this to their aunt. So Lizzie has a father who's from the gentleman class. He doesn't work. His father didn't work. They live off the income of their estates and so on. And then on the other hand, Lizzie has a mother whose family does work. They are people from whose background is middle class bourgeois. They're merchants and lawyers. Okay, and one of her mother's one sister is married to a man who kept up the business in Merrington, the town where she's from, that's nearby Longbourn, their estate, and her sister there is Mrs. Phillips, okay? And now her brother is married and lives in London, and he's also a merchant. That means he's a small business owner, essentially. He has a few employees, he has a servant, he's middle class. His wife, they're the Gardners, and they're very fashionable people. They're polite, they're nice, they're genteel, whatever you call it. They have good sense, good judgment. And the passage I'm going to read you now corresponds. This is where Lizzie gives this definition of love, where she says it's uncivil. Okay, so again, I'm back in chapter 2 of volume 2, overall chapter 25, page 138 in my edition. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th paragraph in any edition. Okay. Lizzie is now discussing with her aunt, who's visiting from London, the fact that Bingley left and has been separated from Jane, and Jane is basically heartbroken by this, right? When alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke more on the subject. That is the subject of Jane and Bingley being separated from each other. It's, quote, "It seems likely to have been a desirable match for Jane," she said. This is her aunt, Mrs. Gardner, commenting on this. "I'm very sorry it went off, that is, it didn't happen. But these things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe, Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her, that these sort of inconstancies are very frequent." "An excellent," and then Lizzie responds now, "an excellent consolation in its way," said Elizabeth. Consolation meaning, this happens all the time, so don't feel too bad. It's not like the same as getting what they wanted, but it's like you should just know that you're not the only person that this happened to. "But it does not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. Us here as women. Men have the advantage here. They have the money, they have the means of seeking more partners. People like Lizzie and Jane do not. They don't have the freedom to move around as much, for example. It does not often happen that the interference of a friend will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with a few days before." And that's the key phrase now, violently in love. Bingley, according to Lizzie, is violently in love with Jane, and her aunt doubts this now. Listen to her aunt. But that expression of, quote, violently in love is so hackneyed, that is cliche, trite, played out, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to a feeling which arises from a half hour's acquaintance as to real strong attachment. Pray, how violently was Mr. Bingley's love? And then Lizzie responds with this famous characterization of love in general, but applied to Bingley in particular. Okay? "I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people, and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke of him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love?" Oh, yes, her aunt now agrees when she hears this definition. Lizzie, again, is a very convincing, brilliant, smart woman. "Oh, yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane, I am sorry for her, because with her disposition, she may not get over it immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed on to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything." Okay, so there you have it. Let's go back to what Lizzie said now. Lizzie said, he's violently in love. And her aunt said, I hear that all the time. Is it true? And she said, yes. And her evidence is that he was being rude to other people. He was growing quite inattentive to other people and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided. At his own ball, he offended. He offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking him to dance, and I spoke to him myself twice myself without receiving an answer. You understand? He's so engrossed by Jane that when you talk to him, he doesn't hear what you're saying. He's so thinking and obsessed by his thoughts of her sister, her beautiful sister Jane. And so it's a very funny definition, but just think about that. How when your friends fall in love with someone, or when you have yourself, you ignore other people. You stop returning your friends' phone calls. You stop texting them back. You're more likely to just kind of be into that one person, and it comes across to everyone else as you're being rude to them. So that's sort of the background where this question and this definition of the novel of love as uncivil comes from. Is not general incivility the very essence of love? She asked that rhetorically. What she's really saying is a statement. The very essence of love is general incivility. This is this key part at the bottom of 138 and top of 139 where this is discussed, okay? So that will give you some background on that. I'm going to, actually, since this ran long, I'm going to make a second video now going over another key moment for the second question, which is when he proposes to her. What I want you to write is her saying something different, okay? So coming up, another video in a second.